everyone. You are listening to Weddings Done Right Radio, the how-to for the I do. This radio show podcast came about because there's so much information out in the world about weddings and planning weddings, and really not too many alternatives to get good, solid advice from the experts in the industry. It's an insider's view of the business and the reality of the wedding day. I am your host, Jody Harris, CEO of Fun at Sight and Sound Events, where I am broadcasting from the wedding capital of the world. You know it, it's Las Vegas, Nevada, and Sight and Sound Events World Headquarters. So who is Jody Harris? That is a very good question. I own Sight and Sound Events with my husband, Pat. I've been in the wedding industry since the early 90s. I am a wedding entertainment producer, director, coordinator, and disc jockey MC. I am a National NACE Professional Member of the Year award winner. I successfully produce many weddings in Las Vegas and around the world, where I am huge, folks, in Ireland. We have a variety of shows on wedding topics like bridal shows and catering and venues and event design and floral, which are available for download on iTunes and YouTube. The way you can support Weddings Done Right Radio, the how-to for the I do, is by rating our show, writing a review, and subscribing on iTunes. You heard a word of mouth? Well, how about word of mouse, as my friend Jasmine Starr would say? Tell your friends who are planning weddings too, and mention to your fellow wedding professionals that you heard a great show on whatever our topic is. And I'm telling you, this show is the one that you need to tell all your wedding professional friends to listen to, because this is going to be a great one. If anyone leaves a review, I promise I will read your name on the air and perhaps even read your review at the end of the show. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, it is Jody Harris, JODIHARRIS, and I love all the Twitter love. And of course, you can also follow my company, which is Sight and Sound, and it's spelled SIGHT. N like Nancy, SOUND. I am super, you can hear it in my voice, right? I am super excited to introduce to you today's guest for our show. It is a close and personal friend of mine, Andy Ebon. His work in the wedding industry spans 4 decades. He spent more than 25 years in Disc Jockey Entertainment. During that period, he owned 2 highly successful mobile DJ companies in San Francisco, Music Man and Designer Music. His companies were responsible for more than 2,000, that's right, it's not a typo, 2,000 weddings. Andy was the DJ and hosted about 900 of those weddings. Since the late 1990s, Andy has stayed heavily involved in the wedding and hospitality industry as a public speaker, business consultant, and writer. But beyond his independent work, he's become a regular contributor for The Knot with their business-to-business division. He will be writing for their blog, giving webinars, and speaking to wedding professionals. Today's show title, it's a great one. It's How to Avoid Weddings of Mass Destruction, Part 1, a discussion of wedding priorities, budgeting, and what really matters. Andy, welcome to Weddings Done Right Radio.
Nice to be here. Thanks, Jody.
Awesome. So I'm going to get right started because, we can go on forever. We're not at Einstein's.
And that's why it's part 1.
That's why it's part 1. Exactly. So I'm going to ask you right from the start, how did you come up with the title, How to Avoid Weddings of Mass Destruction?
Well, I'm a regular speaker at the Wedding MBA, Wedding Merchants Business Academy, and their head producer, Will Hegarty, is one for inventive titles. And I wanted to do a presentation from the vendor's point of view about the dysfunction that sometimes occurs within the wedding industry at receptions in particular. And it just hit me. It was a sound-alike for weapons of mass destruction. And I mentioned this, and I didn't even get to explain what this was going to be about. Will was all about this title, and it stuck. So this show today is an offshoot of that presentation, which was made to about 1,500 wedding professionals, and it was a lot of fun. And
we're actually gearing this toward our audience today, our brides, because you've given this to professionals.
And it's interesting. I've been working on writing it to publish as a book, and one of the things that I found was it's impossible to talk to both audiences at the same time. So I've decided to take two different directions. I'm going to have a version for the brides, and I'm going to have a version for the wedding professionals. So it'll be geared toward the reader. So today, we're going to talk to the brides, but it's okay if the vendors and other professionals listen in.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, good. Well, I'm excited. So let's dive into the topic here. How much money is spent on an average wedding in the United States? And what does that really mean?
You know, it's interesting. There are different research from different sources there. The Knot does research that they publish. There's an organization in Tucson called the Wedding Report. And they both come in the high 20,000, 27, 28,000. It varies a little. It went down when the economy went south a few years ago. It's come back up a little bit. But number one, that's a national average, and it means very little because your wedding, if you are listening in Manhattan, that average is going to be different than it is in Las Vegas. It's going to be different than it is in South Bend, Indiana, or North Dakota. So what's average, just market by market, could be 17,000, could be 50,000 in Manhattan. So when you listen to averages, you need to put that aside. And the other thing is the brides out there listening are saying, well, my wedding isn't going to be average. Maybe there's lots of money to spend in her family. Maybe there's somebody else who's got financial limitations. So averages are just statistics, and they're not really relevant to the individual bride. When you see statistics that the average live band is X number of dollars, or the average amount of money spent on florals is Y number of dollars, those don't really mean anything in the real world.
Wow. So what does a bride do? I mean, where do they go? I mean, they're reading these magazines that are telling them this is the average. What do they do?
Well, the first thing is really what they shouldn't do. What they shouldn't do is, for example, walk into, let's say, a floral designer with a page that they've torn out from one of the great local or national wedding publications and say, here, this is what I want. A sane florist will say something soft like, well, have you set aside $90,000 to spend on flowers? Because this is a $90,000 wedding. You can't simply come in and say, replicate this, and I've got $7,000 to do it. It's good to draw ideas, but ultimately, I think the biggest mistake that people make is they don't leave themselves enough time to figure out what's possible with the money they have. And it's fine to be inspired, and one never wants to take away the excitement and the enthusiasm, but somewhere between that $90,000 wedding, which is maybe for 5% of our audience, and what, not the average bride, but what most brides have to spend, there's a midpoint that they need to arrive at and not lose all control of what's going to happen.
So that brings us to a wedding budget. So we hear the term wedding budget and budget bride often. I know that I get calls from, brides around the country saying, we're on a budget. In your experience, what exactly do those terms mean?
Nothing, really. They're what a bride says when she really doesn't know the right question to ask. And that's not to be condescending at all. If I go shopping for tires, if I don't really know what to ask, I'm going to ask, either, how much does this cost, or can I replace the tires on my car for $50 a wheel? If the last time I bought tires was 10 years ago, that's what I remember. The word budget it really means this is how much money I have in my purse, or it means this is how much my family and the groom's family is throwing down. This is how much we've got. It doesn't really mean that we've made a plan, and that's what a budget really means. It means we've set aside not just a total amount of money, but we've planned for each element of the wedding and wedding reception, so much for this, so much for that, and then let's take that a step further, which is how did we arrive at those numbers? If my sister got married in Florida 5 years ago and she spent X number of dollars for, I don't know, the cake, let's say, for 150 people, and you're getting married in Seattle next year and you've got 240 people, does what she spent have any relation to what you're going to spend? Not much, except you're both buying cake. So one needs to start asking questions and ultimately find out what the range is for what you're looking for in a particular product or service in your market, and start to figure it out. And a little bit of, how shall I say, when I say ignorance, I mean you don't know what you don't know. And it's okay, that's okay. But if you just ask price and you don't get more information about what you're looking for, you're more likely to make the big mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I'm still kind of confused. I mean, where are they coming up with these? I mean, I'll get a phone call, for example, and someone will say to me, I have $500 to spend on a DJ. Are you telling me that they're coming up with that number $500 because that's what their sister spent, or that's just what's in their wallet?
It could be any number of things. Number one, they may talk to friends who've made decisions. They may have family members who've made decisions. There are websites that will feed back to you the statistical research. But when somebody says, even in, let's take Las Vegas. I mean, the Las Vegas Valley is 2 million people. Even within the Las Vegas Valley, more money is spent in some areas than others. And that's not what things cost. Really what we're talking about is what people have elected to spend. That's what these statistics are based on. And so people are throwing darts. The worst dart they can throw is, this is all the money I have left to spend on fill in the blank, a videographer, a disc jockey, or whatever the case may be. And that's not a budget, and that's not reality. If to get the job done for whatever it is that one is buying, if it takes $900, not $500 to do the job well, that's when you hit the MasterCard and you go over. Because ultimately, some of the decisions you might make, if they're only based on how much money you've allotted, maybe because that's all you have, or maybe because you overspent in another area, you will regret those decisions later on.
Mm-hmm. Do you recommend that the brides, where do you recommend that they start?
I think it's always best to start with magazines, just for the visual. And it's not unusual, even though magazines generally, print media are declining. Wedding magazines are not. Good local directories and bridal guides and bridal planners are always a good place to start. And the national magazines are great for ideas. You can find websites from here to eternity. And I think that now we're starting to see more wedding businesses start on Pinterest. But it's more than what kind of medium do you start with. It's what are the big decisions, and that's where you begin.
Great advice. Do you recommend that the brides that are listening to the show and are looking for services, do you recommend that they go online, like you said, magazines, and you talked about going online. Do you recommend that they actually pick up the phone and call the different vendors and just to get a feel for what rates are like?
No, I think the first thing they should do is read. Whether it's online on different sites, everybody has suggestions, everybody has tips, whether they're a vendor, whether they're a magazine. The best thing you can do is educate yourself before you start talking money, and you'll get a sense of what are important things to ask and what better answers are. And I think the challenge here is there are a lot of right answers. There are also some wrong answers. Mm-hmm. But it's a research project. Probably the average average engagement runs maybe 9 to 12 or 9 to 15 months. And this may be a shock to you out there, but if you took longer, it wouldn't be a bad idea. The second you set your date, the clock starts ticking. And as you figure out that you're making literally hundreds of decisions, and you're doing this big event for the first time, and you've got to get virtually everything right. Regardless, again, this is not a money issue, it's a decision-making issue. You really start to feel the heat. So the more you know before you ask anybody about money, the better off you are.
Do you recommend the planner? Then hiring a planner is a great way to start, somebody locally who can help you?
Well, I think that every bride that has the resources would benefit from hiring a wedding planner. The thing that a wedding planner can do for you, and there are different kinds of wedding planners. Let me start with that. You have people that are designers who their forte is the beauty and theme and colors and flowers and all the finery that can make something really dramatic. There are planners who are more about both carrying out the bride's ideas, but they're more about the function itself and making sure all the moving parts work together. And then finally, you've got some people who are coordinators who are more sort of last-minute things. But I think that the big thing that a planner does is they tell you the truth. And most planners work for a flat fee. And they may have their preferences about which vendors are better than other ones from their own experience, but they're not earning their fee based on getting a percentage of a fee from a vendor. If they have a recommendation, you should listen to it. They will not want to make decisions for you as a bride. They will want to interview you, understand what your goals are, understand what your fears are, what your tastes are, and funnel you toward a smaller assortment of vendors in a particular category. Depending what it is, it might be 2 or 3, it might be 4 or 5, and hopefully, if you've hired a good planner, you'll be choosing from 3 or 4 good answers. And that's what a planner can do, is they can keep you within a circle of good choices and my big thing, keep you away from the big mistakes. You only need to make a few big mistakes to wipe out 100 good decisions.
Absolutely. And I think when you go in with, if you go in with that low number for a particular service, a videographer, for example, they'll be realistic and say to you, listen, all the videographers that I've ever met, nobody's in that price range. I think you need to find money elsewhere.
Well, I think one of the things that I know you and I have talked about is the way many services in the wedding industry price themselves is, when I say misleading, I don't mean it's misleading in a negative way, but we'll talk about entertainment that is going to perform from this time to that time, or so many hours of coverage from a photographer, that sort of thing. And that's X number of dollars an hour, or so much for the coverage. And there are, the gold, the silver, and the platinum packages that include these things and that thing, those other things. But what they don't explain is a photographer has an incredible amount of time that is involved in planning and doing things outside the time that they're covering the wedding. The same thing for an entertainer. Probably a videographer has the most incredible amount of time in production work after they've shot all the footage. It's not that shooting isn't important and framing things well and covering everything is important. But ultimately, what you want is, out of 6-7 hours of coverage, you want to walk away, a few weeks later with a 1-hour video that you'll want to watch again and again and isn't like War and Peace. And so we price things in an oversimplified manner because people see the time that you're there serving the bride, but that really doesn't tell the whole story. And if you've never hired a videographer before, you wouldn't know that.
So that's where the education comes in. That's where these girls have to become better aware of what it is that we do.
It's interesting. One of the things that would drive me nuts in my time as a DJ, and I'm sure you've run into it, is you feel like you're sparring on the phone with a bride about, well, okay, so you've got so many people and you want us from 7 to 11. And then I would ask the question, well, when do the doors open? Well, the doors open at 6, but we only need you from 7 to 11. And I'd say, I feel like there's something you're not telling me. Well, we have a harpist from 6 to 7, so, we don't need you during that hour. And then I would go on to explain that, unfortunately, we had not really yet perfected the Star Trek method of setting up, and we couldn't beam in our equipment, and any professional entertainer, band or DJ, would want to be there and set up and be ready to go, not at 7 o'clock, not at 6 o'clock, at 20 minutes of 6 o'clock, so that if people got there early from the ceremony, we were ready. And it would be professionally unacceptable to be setting up anything during that 6 to 7 hour. You can't be in your jeans and polo shirt rolling in equipment while a fully dressed crowd has already arrived. And that, no, you shouldn't expect to pay an hour of entertainment cost at whatever rate that is, but you should expect to pay some setup time because the owner of the company has to pay that DJ or roadie or whatever the case may be, probably both of them, to be there and be set up. And yes, stand around during 6 to 7, but that hour doesn't just magically appear from somewhere. And so these are the things that somebody's trying to save money, and they're not a bad person. They just don't understand the logistics of it. Usually when you explain it, they get it pretty quickly, but what I would say to a bride is, and anybody that would agree to show up and set up between 6 and 7 while you've got 135 guests there, you should run in the other direction because they're trying to yes you to death, and it's not in your best interest.
And there are a lot of businesses and companies out there to get your business that will yes you to death, and then maybe later on come back and say, I need an extra $100.
Well, yes, and you know, ultimately, it's more complicated than it looks. And the more, as we've talked about, the more you can educate yourself and listen and not worry too much about somebody trying to sell you, but trying to explain the process a little. It's taxing on a bride to hear the different things. But after you talk to a few different vendors in a category, you will get a better sense of it.
And I think after you talk to a few vendors in a category, and I'm big on the phone call. I know I've expressed to you many, many times how frustrated I am when we get emails. No phone number, just an email. And I understand you girls are busy. I do get it. But if you're seriously considering hiring a company, I wouldn't make my touch with them. Send me your prices. I'm getting married at Planet Hollywood, July 7th. I need 4 hours, 7 to 11. What are your rates? I mean, I'm just frustrated with that.
Well, and you should be. And what's odd is from when I started way back when with weddings in the mid to late 70s, we also struggled to get phone numbers. But now it was the same problem, oddly enough, but in a completely different media era. And for many brides, they're comfortable with email, they're comfortable with text, but they feel that's a conversation, and I feel it's a ping pong match. And I would much rather get somebody on the phone. I would much rather Skype with a bride that's in a different market. I still think now that the best thing still is bridal shows, because there are certain things, certain services, certain kinds of services that if you don't get to know the person that's going to be particularly what comes to mind is photographer, the person that is going to be with you 8-10 hours the whole day, you don't know anything. You know that their photos look wonderful, and that's fine. Everybody can looks good until they open their mouth, and then the question is, do you click with them? And if you do click with them, your photos are going to be better looking. They didn't become a better photographer. You're just more compatible with them. And I haven't come up with smell-o-vision yet. You know, we can't smell the food. We can't smell the flowers. There are certain things that you get a better sense of in person. But the mid-level step is don't be scared to get on the phone with somebody. You'll get a lot more questions answered, not just more quickly, but you'll get a lot better context than playing a ping pong match with emails. And I'm not saying emails aren't helpful. You know, if a bride is in contract with a hotel for her reception, you know, a one-way communication, like the change in the number of people. Oh my gosh, it looks like we're going to have closer to 150 than 125. Is that going to be a problem? Oh, well, no, it's not, but we will be able to move you to this other room. That's a one-way communication. If it's no problem, you'll get a response back that says, we can do it, we'll put you in this room rather than that room, end of story. That's not a big, I wouldn't call that a conversation.
How do you feel? I mean, should the brides look at vendors' social media as a way of making decisions? Should that be important?
I think what you get from social media is you get the personality of the business. You see what kind of people they're working with, what kind of places they're working, ad frequently, and whether it's all about the vendor or it's all about the bride and the groom, whether they enjoy the people they work with, you can get a real sense of personality. And now with Pinterest, you can get a sense of style. When a photographer presents their own work, that's one thing. But when they present the work of the florist, the decor company, the catering company that they work with, you get a deeper sense, and you click through to that other vendor site. I think Facebook. I should tell our listeners I have a love-hate relationship with Facebook because I think it's kind of like almost like an old singles bar that everybody wants to be seen there. So again, I think it depends on what you look at. There are portfolios of photos in Facebook that are great. I don't think for the bride that Twitter is as useful as the other visual mediums like Facebook has become and like Pinterest is. And I think that YouTube is something that we don't think about enough, that you can search for a disc jockey or a photographer, and you can find a demo video. You don't just find the demo video of a videographer on YouTube. You may find demos of these other companies. You may find a tour of a hotel, and that gives you a three-dimensional look at what's going on. So all of those are good resources. And I think one of the challenges to today's bride is the resources are unlimited. So you can research something to death. And you can get paralyzed at some point, and realizing that when everything in a category starts to look the same, you need to stop and breathe. And if you can no longer tell the difference between one invitation company and another, you need to give it a rest and then come back and revisit and understand the differences between companies.
And it is important that when you are researching, and I agree, you can just lose your mind. You just become overwhelmed at all this stuff. But if they haven't blogged in like 6 months, but you're considering another company that blogs once a month or twice a month, should that be a signal? Should that be a red flag?
Well, again, I think it's just as much of a challenge for the businesses that get involved in all these social media. And if a business is going to have a presence, whether it's on Facebook or blogging or whatever it is, it should be a regular thing. And that shows you the personality of that business, that they've decided they're going to have a presence in these 3 or 4 areas, and they stay with it. And I think that's a big positive for the business, and the bride should notice that. And having a blog is probably the best place to tell a story, and whether it's about the vendors that you work with, or something very cool that a bride did recently, or why a particular photographer was inventive in how he presented and how he framed the photos, how he didn't just use the cliche staircase at a particular hotel to tell that you could find in every bride's shots from that hotel, but something completely different. I think those things come out of blogs. I do have one other thought about social media, which is, again, a blessing and a curse. It's all the reviews that can be read, whether they're on local sites or they're on The Knot or they're on Wedding Wire or Yelp or wherever they may be. I would say that those need to be treated like Olympic scoring, which is to say, when they're scoring the ice skating, you throw out the high scores and you throw out the low scores, and you see, what's in the middle. And I think that people that are engaged for a while will start to weed out the nonsense, and the nonsense could be the hyperbole about how great it was, or it could be the bride that just has something to complain about. I think one needs to really read the reviews and not just be happy with so-and-so was the greatest, fill in the blank. You really learn when people say they were great because it felt like the MC was one step ahead of everything that was about to happen, and we didn't have to think about anything. Or the timing of the meal service seemed to flow like some of the best restaurants we've been in. You immediately know what that felt like, as opposed to the thing felt like stop-and-go traffic from beginning to end. And again, I would want to read why that was. Was it a lack of coordination between the vendors, or was the caterer not pushing things out fast enough, that between the first plate that was brought out and the last plate that was served was, 57 minutes, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. So the person with the most reviews isn't necessarily the big winner.
No, it isn't. And one of the things that I'm uncomfortable with is I see too many 5.0s on many sites, that 5 stars, because after a while, if you're looking again at any given category, whether it's cakes or flowers or entertainment or whatever it might be, if you're looking at a dozen different 5-star ratings, you've effectively learned nothing. And the only thing you can do then is go into what's actually said and start to pick it apart. And reviews should be used as a guideline. You shouldn't live or die on the reviews. You should make some of your own decisions and do some research. Ask them who they work with. And when you're talking to one vendor, ask about a different category. You may be asked by a florist, so who else are you looking at? Well, they may be curious about that, and you might want to share that. A better question would be, you're in the floral design business. What bakers do you like to work with? And have a professional tell you about how they like to work with this particular baker, because you can work together and dress the cake table and not be stepping all over each other, which is, some people have respect for the other person's work and other people not so much.
So vendor referrals are huge.
I think the vendors know better, but what they don't know is they don't necessarily know what the bride asked for from that other vendor. So, for example, if I would talk to a photographer at a mixer on a Wednesday and say, how did my DJ Paul do Saturday night? And the photographer said, oh, it's too much hard rock and, it's too much heavy metal and, whatever. Well, he doesn't know what the bride asked for. And maybe Paul was at that wedding very specifically because the bride had some certain musical tastes, along with whatever she was going to play for the older crowd. And so what he had done was absolutely within the guidelines of what the bride wanted. So you always have to dig a little deeper. When somebody says thumbs up or thumbs down, if they're giving the judgment from their point of view rather than from the customer's point of view, one really needs to figure that out and ask that question.
Okay. Yeah, no, good advice. What are some of the most important factors in planning a successful wedding reception?
Some of the most important factors, well, I gave the big one, which was giving enough time. And
giving enough time?
Giving enough time in the engagement process and giving enough time with individual vendors. If you just do it in quick nuggets, when you set an appointment with a photographer, with an entertainment company, whatever it may be, find out what is going to be enough time and bring all the decision makers. Now, let me define what all is. If you and your fiance are the decision makers, then you and your fiance should be there. If your family is paying for the whole thing, there usually are some strings attached. And if your mother or your mother and father are going to either support you or veto a decision, and they're not there for that discussion, then that's a problem. So I think you will drive yourself crazy and you will drive vendors crazy if you don't have the right people. Now, if you've watched any of these TV shows like Say Yes to the Dress, mm-hmm. there's a certain amount of truth in don't do this by committee. And that if everybody is going to be involved in your decision, you're going to find that some people will support you and some people will be envious of you and some people seem to be contrary because there may be some envy in the situation. But I can tell you this, even if everybody is on the same page, if you have 6 people trying to help you make any single decision, that's too many people.
I agree. I mean, I've had couples come into this, mm-hmm. World headquarters, and it's like weekend, the weekend in Las Vegas. I'm like, oh, who are these people? Oh, that's Floyd, and that's Marianne, and that's John, and that's Bill. And I'm like, hi, guys. I mean, I have to bring in chairs, and it just even makes selling very uncomfortable for the vendor.
Well, sure. It becomes a juggling act, and a good salesman, and I mean that from the standpoint of somebody who really understands how to help people work through the process to make a decision to buy a product or service that's within their means. Again, I'm going to stay away from the word budget, but help them make a decision. That's a highly skilled professional person. If you're having them have this discussion with half a dozen people, it's going to be bumpy, and in most cases, you're going to walk away having been distracted and unable to sort out the important questions.
Mm-hmm. And that comes down to, like, everybody seems to want to give advice to the bride and groom. You know, Aunt Sophie, wants to help plan her sister's daughter's wedding. You know, I mean, how do you deal with that?
All right, for brides, let me tell you a secret.
Uh-oh.
Some mothers are reliving their wedding that maybe they didn't have, and they're trying to use you as the outlet. Other times it is Aunt so-and-so who is the general and believes that she's in charge and is injecting themselves. And other times it's a girlfriend in your wedding party who turns into something or someone that you've never known. And it's really important at as early a level, as early a point in the engagement as you think is necessary to tell people how you want them to participate. And some people, it's just like buying a house. Everybody who's bought a house will have advice, and they will tell you their success or their failure, and they will lay it on top of you. They don't ask, as a good wedding professional, ask, what's your goal? What do you want to look like? What do you want people to remember? What do you want to remember 10 or 20 years from now? They'll just tell you their good or bad experience and project that on you. And you need to, as softly but firmly as you can, let these helpful individuals, let them know that they're being maybe a little more helpful than you'd like them to be. And that may sound like putting them in their place. It isn't that forceful, but it's really important because it's a very emotional process, and you need to let people know.
And the bride and groom, I mean, their role on their wedding day, I mean, it's all about them. It's their special event. It's their day. I mean, they're the host, right? They're the host of a great party.
Yes and no. It's their day, and again, their special day is one of those. If you hear that in cliche mode from a salesperson, run away. But it's multiple things. But
why run away?
Well,
why run away? I mean, everybody says it's your day. You're the star. It's, That
means they don't know how to sell and they don't know how to communicate. When people, for example, use the word perfect, I think that's probably the lamest word they can use, because that injects kind of a pass-fail situation that if it's not 100% or more of your expectations, that somehow things have failed. And probably the only name I'll drop during this discussion is Colin Cowie, who I heard speak at a National Association of Catering Executives meeting as a keynote speaker. And he talked about the word perfect, and he said that's hyperbole of the worst kind, that in fact the day never goes without issues, but that if you've surrounded yourself with a great planner, and in his case, and other wedding professionals that know what they're doing, that they will insulate you as the bride and groom from anything that is awry, and they will handle it. But to think that nothing ever went wrong the whole day is baloney, and some problems are bigger than others, but the wedding professionals will insulate you. Going back to what should the bride and groom do, it's their day, and they should enjoy each other, they should enjoy the wedding party, and recognize that they're hosts for their family and friends. And again, in planning, keep that in mind. If you just talk to the DJ entertainer about the music that you like, and you don't take into account your parents and your parents' crowd and other elements within your two families, maybe they're different ethnicities and there's some ethnic music that needs to be involved. If you're not taking care of the entire crowd as best you can, then you're not being a good host. So, and it's easy with everybody telling you, it's your special day, it's your day, you can have anything you want, that it starts to go to your head, And you need to have a best friend who will poke you in the sternum and say, you're becoming very selfish here. You're hosting 150 people from 17 states and New Jersey.
Oh.
and you really need to think about everybody that's here and not just about yourself. And you've got to have a couple people like that in your life that don't just tell you it's all going to be flowers and candy, because it's a lot of pressure.
I think the best receptions that I've been to or I've produced are the ones that are very well-rounded and well thought out for everybody. Those are the most fun. I remember years ago, having to DJ a wedding where the bride and groom were like, it's all about the country music, all about the country music. Don't even think about playing anything else but country music. Well, guess what? We all know.
All right. So
it bombed.
Okay. So let me tell you my story about that. I was doing my company was providing service for a San Francisco wedding, and all the arrangements had been made by the bride's mother. And it turns out that the bride and groom worked or lived somewhere else, and they were coming into San Francisco for the wedding. And I'd had the worst time trying to get an event sheet to describe the music and the events from the client. Finally, I get a fax from the groom 2 days before the wedding, and I get him on the phone. And he had indicated on the event sheet that he wanted nothing but blues. And I try to talk him out of this. And then I soon realized that this was a power problem, a power struggle with the mother-in-law who had taken care of everything, and he felt like he didn't have any involvement in the thing. So he finally said to me, and this was the turning point, he said, just like you described about the country, he said, all I want is blues. I'll bring these CDs, you have those CDs, and you can tell the DJ to leave everything back at the office. And I just stopped and I said, well, I could do that. I said, but it would be really unprofessional to leave all the standard music collection at the office in the 1% chance that you're not right. I said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring Paul into the office early, and I'm going to let him know that this is what you want. And that if anybody asks for anything different, they're going to have to go to you to get it approved. And he is not going to change gears musically until you come to him, not your best man, not your wife, not your mother-in-law, until you come to him and say, do something different. And he said, that's exactly what I want. That's cool. Now, I had to go through my disc jockey who was giving me, but, it's like, I said, look, I think this is a bad idea. And if it's going to fail, it needs to fail quickly. So do not deviate. Wait for him to come up to you. And I said, I predict it will change quickly. And Paul left me a note after the event. He said, boy, you had this right. He said, after about 40 minutes, he came to me and said, do your own thing. And everything changed from there. But sometimes as a wedding professional, you get caught in the family politics, and you have to do your best to do what you think is best for the situation, which means the bride and groom, the entire family, and the entire event. Who the client is, technically, is whoever autographs the agreement. Who the client is actually is the bride and groom and their families and their guests, and you as a professional need to understand your overall mission as well as the person that's directing traffic. And the only thing that changes is if you've hired a wedding planner, the bride and groom have delegated all that decision-making to him or her. And then you need to follow whatever they tell you, and don't shortcut that and go to the bride and groom.
And I think brides and grooms who are listening to the show need to let their vendors or wedding planner know that there is some sort of family, politics going on. It's very important. A lot of times vendors don't ask. Like you'll see divorced parents. And
I've seen as many as 4 sets of parents. And what I like to talk about is the no surprise rule. I don't want to find out about those in-family discomforts or dysfunctions the day of a reception. I would like to know that, dad is dating somebody, but mom is bringing her boyfriend, and so after a couple of drinks, this this is what it is. And I remember very distinctly a couple saying, you know, all these various parents and boyfriends and girlfriends that our parents have, geez, do we have to do a father-daughter, mother-son dance? I said, no. I said, your DJ can just invite all the parents and their significant others to join along with the rest of the wedding party. You do what works best for the situation. And if you know that there's tension, you do what's necessary to diffuse the tension.
But you need to let your vendor know.
Exactly. And
especially photography. I would think that would be the one. Like, you can't have, dad and mom together because...
Sure. And again, you don't need to know their family history about who cheated on who and what the thing is.
Correct.
But you just need to know what the dynamics are so that if you're posing people or you're working on a seating chart, that you take those things into account.
Especially the brides. I mean, when
absolutely
they need to let the vendors know with the seating chart and the posing.
And the seating chart is easy, but the posing is a big deal. And again, family dynamics. One of the things, again, no surprises, is as an entertainer, I finally learned after a while that you don't just give anybody the microphone. I would coach the bride and groom that, what's on your event sheet is what is going to happen. And if somebody comes up and says, we'd really like to, do a money dance for, our niece. If you, as the bride, have not decided that a money dance is something that you want to do, we're not going to put them in the position to, put you under the gun. There's no right or wrong. There are family traditions. There are ethnic traditions. But you are the boss. The boss says, the bride and groom.
I agree. I mean, many times you'll get an uncle who will, when it's time to do the toast, and you introduce the best man and the maid of honor, and then the bride and groom thank everybody. An uncle will just, get up and I'm the uncle. And, as a vendor, you try to tell them no. And I know that, in my company, these are questions that I ask. What if somebody, you said Andy and Jessica are going to be doing the toast. What if somebody else comes up? Are you going to be okay with that? Or they'll tell me ahead of time, keep the microphone away from Uncle Pat. Oh my gosh, he can talk.
And a lot of times as a bride and groom, you may not even be ready for that answer. You may need to be guided. What you'll get is, you'll give as a response is, geez, I don't know. What do you think? And they'll go back to the entertainer and say, what should I do? And you have to explain what the issue is. It's like, well, this is going to be right before the meal. And if you have allotted 10, 15 minutes for toast, and this runs to half an hour, you're going to be eating rubber chicken. Mm-hmm. And so at some point, we have to have, as they say in old show business terms, we have to have the hook. And we have to be able to say, thank you very much, Uncle Pat, but, now we need to, serve the food while it's hot and ideal to be served, and, we'll get back to you later. And you have to be careful with humor, but you need to keep things moving.
I think the biggest takeaway is communication.
It's communication and the planning that could be done in advance that I think is maybe the least obvious is a realistic timeline and the logistics of the room, the layout and the physical layout. Timelines need to allow for people to get from point A to point B. When the cocktail hour is over, it needs to allow for some time for people to get seated. If a photographer takes people out for 20 minutes of photos, they better not come back in an hour. All those moving parts have to work together. So if a timeline is unrealistic, and let's face it, I haven't figured out how this is done, but in this Weddings of Mass Destruction speech, I put up 4 clocks on a slide, and I said, there's the bride's time, the DJ's time, the photographer's time, the videographer's time, and the caterer's time. Well, that's 5 clocks, but you get the idea. And ultimately, there should be one standard timeline that everybody buys into, and everybody needs to cooperate, realizing that it's not so much the amount of time for things, it's the order of things and having a little flexibility. If a caterer, for example, is hell-bent on serving the cake at a particular time, and the party is really, at full tilt, it's really okay to not do it at that time, to do it at 10:30 rather than at 10, and certainly not to make it earlier when it was designed for later, because that may signal the end to the reception to people. And if you've hired everybody till midnight, you don't want to send a signal that the party's over at 10:05. So rolling with that. And then in terms of logistics, don't overstuff a room. Don't put 150 people in a room for 120 and make it impossible for people to get around. Don't sit your grandparents next to the speakers for the band or the disc jockey. You know what's going to happen? They're going to complain about the volume. It won't even need to be too loud. You will have just put the people in the wrong places. And, creating a situation that works for your event and works for the venue and works for everything that's going on is not rocket science, but sometimes when people do things again and again and again the same way, there's a cue when they say to you, well, we always set the room up like this. And that's a cue that they probably do everything the same way, and they need to go work for Federal Express because they've lost the creativity in their weddings. Or our dance floor is built in over here, but we want the disc jockey over in Oshkosh in the corner. Bad idea. The disc jockey needs to have eye contact and be able to step out on the floor to MC. And many places in medium or larger size weddings, you've got a DJ MC and you've got somebody who's actually playing the music. So you need to have them in reasonable proximity to the dance floor. So these are the things to look for and, again, listen for. Well, we always do it that way. We always set it up that way. And if they're that rigid, that doesn't bode well.
So how do you get around that?
You keep looking.
Or what if you fell in love with a particular country club or beach club and that's what they tell you?
This is the tough love for Mandy. I remember being asked to work at a place that wanted to require any entertainment company to put down a $500 deposit. And I've never heard of this before. And I was asked by the bride to call the place. And I said, well, why is this? They said, well, so-and-so, a photographer, backed up and knocked over a palm tree. And ever since then, we, any vendor that's going to be on site, we require this deposit. I said, okay. I said, but I carry $1 million liability. Will that take care of it? And they said, no, we require a $500 deposit, and your reception is September 4th. I said, well, when would we receive that money back? And they said, well, we cut our checks once a month at the end of the month.
Wow.
And that was one of the, and I mean, when I say handful, maybe 3 events that I elected not to complete. And I called the bride up and I said, this is very unusual behavior. I said, in fact, in 20 years in this industry, I've never seen this. And you want people looking for things to go right, and that it's not all about anybody, but clearly this policy is unreasonable. I'm sure they have a handful of people that they work with, and you should hire one of them. But I wouldn't send one of my professionals into that situation. I wouldn't go into that situation. And I realize that you saw us at another event and you'd like to have us work the reception, but you've picked a venue that is inflexible. And when you've chosen a venue that is inflexible in certain manners, and this was not even about the actual reception, this was just a business policy, you need to recognize that you bought that, and you need to own it. And don't think that somehow they're going to be different the day of the reception, or don't think that that personality isn't going to show up in other ways. The question you need to ask yourself as a bride listening to the show is, if I'm presented with something that is a little over the top in that sort of respect, that they're inflexible, did that show itself before I signed the agreement, or are they showing up with these policies after the fact? And, there's a way out, oftentimes, but the better thing is to get your questions answered going in. Do they have a noise ordinance? When I worked in San Francisco, and this can be true in all parts of the country, any mansion was for rent. Lobbies in private schools, all kinds of city hall. You could get anything, but there was always a noise ordinance. Now the question is, as an entertainer, where do you measure the noise? Do you put up a sound? Well, help me out, Jody. What's the word for it?
A sound meter, like a sound.
Yeah, I wanted to call it a noisometer, but
no, there is actually such a thing as a noise. What was it?
Decibel meter.
Decibel meter. Thank you, Pat. Do you put that right up in front of the speaker, or are you measuring the sound across the street? And what's the policy? And is there a cutoff time? Sometimes a client will hire you till 11 o'clock, but the neighborhood rule is. The ordinance is that you can only go till 10. Mm. Well, you got to know all these things going in. If you're renting an unusual place, you need to ask, are there any special rules or limitations? And as a vendor, it's important that vendors have been to these kinds of special locations before. With most hotels, it's pretty easy. You should know your way around. A site visit tells you probably most of the things you need to know. But if you work with unique locations, such as 100-year-old buildings or freestanding things, you need to know what the rules of the road are, or you get bitten.
And they need to show you that before you sign the contract.
Oh, sure. But
sometimes these brides find out later.
Well, and that's the thing. And sometimes I think we suffer because we know our own businesses better than anybody else, so we fail to disclose. And so it isn't even that somebody's trying to mislead the bride. It's they just forget to ask the question.
Mm-hmm. What I wanted to there's so much, and this is a part one, yes. Of course. What I wanted to do in part one is if there was one big piece of advice that you can give to a bride that revolves around our show, part one. Yep. What would that be?
It's Ebon's law of disproportionate value, is that at the end of the night, your different products and services and people serving you are not wearing a price tag, and that certain decisions you make have disproportionately more or less importance. You will spend maybe as much as 50% on your venue and your catering. On the other hand, you may elect to spend $2,000 for a cake or $500 for a cake. If you've got $2,000 to spend and it doesn't affect your spending in another area, that's fine. But at the end of the day, if you overspent on your cake, but you came away with third-rate photographs, it's your photographs and your videography that you're going to have for the rest of your life. It is the entertainment that is the glue and the MC that is the facilitator that can either make or break your reception. So what you spend on each thing is not necessarily reflective of the importance of each of those things. And you'll learn that most by talking to your friends that have been married and asking them, what would you do differently looking back, and why? And if they say, gosh, we thought we were doing okay by saving a few $100 on the DJ entertainer, and boy, was that a bad idea. Or if you look at Craigslist, you can always find a cheaper photographer. But at some point, if you either spend the most money or the least money on something, that's a pretty bad idea. And you need to ask yourself, ultimately, as we mentioned earlier, what do you want to remember, 10, 20 years down the road? What do you want to, when you show a video to your kids, what do you want them to see? And remember that there are things that you won't see, you will only see when they're played back on video. So in the rearview mirror, put yourself 20 years, 30 years in the future, and what do you want to remember?
I think that is a great way to close out show number one. Weddings of Mass Destruction, part one.
I will see you for part two.
Yes, you will. You will see Andy Ebon back for part 2, so check the blog. You'll get more information on that. If you want to get in touch with Andy, for any wedding professionals listening today, make it a point to listen to to visit Andy's blog. We're saying to listen. You can listen to Andy's blog right here on Weddings Done Right Radio. But if you make it a point to visit Andy's blog, the Wedding Marketing Blog, that's the weddingmarketingblog.com. And brides, they can look at you too. I mean,
sure.
Why not?
You can hear what we're talking or read what we're talking about.
Absolutely, to become better educated. Thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to this great show. Again, I want to thank my guest, Andy Ebon, for coming down. It's not Einstein's, but,
hey,
we're at World Headquarters. What can I tell you?
I appreciate it.
And again, the biggest thing you can do to support our show here is to write a review on iTunes. And, of course, you can always follow me on Twitter. I am Jody Harris, CEO of Fun, Sight and Sound Events, Weddings Done Right Radio, the how-to for the I Do. Have a fantastic one.